Well, it is 3 weeks till Easter. Can you believe that? Like, we just say, like, it's the beginning of Lent, we have an Ash Wednesday service, we say it's a great season to reflect, and then it just seems like it goes by like that. So I've been finding the ability to do some good reflecting during the season, and I hope you're able to find some of that too. As Ken mentioned, a great place to do that is here on Wednesday evenings. This room is open from 6 to 8 p.m., and you can come in and spend 10 minutes, or you can stay longer, and whatever works for your soul. And it's a quiet place to be with you, because you know sometimes we aren't with ourselves. You know that, right? It's a quiet place to be with you and to be with God. And so we're moving toward Easter. For me, I suppose, especially as a pastor, I start thinking this time of year, okay, we're moving toward Easter, and we start to think about the death and resurrection of Jesus. And when I start to think about that, one of the interesting things to me about the early years of the Jesus community in the first century is the way that this idea of resurrection evolves. And I don't think we usually think about that. But in the Gospels, the question of resurrection comes up in Jesus' conversations with religious leaders. And the reason the question of resurrection comes up is because a big chunk of the Jewish people in Jesus' day didn't believe there ever would be a resurrection. And another big group believed that there would be a resurrection. And it was one of the things that they argued and fought about. Of course, in the Old Testament, there's not much talk about afterlife. Just a couple of little places, Jesus actually draws those out. But there wasn't really much of a detailed thought. Hebrew life was more concerned with how we're relating to God and living it now. And then it was later, kind of just before the time Jesus shows up, it really came out of the Babylonian exile that they got exposed to ideas of resurrection, and they started to say, well, you know, maybe that is where God takes this whole thing. So they were always arguing about it, and that's why it comes up in the Gospels. And you might remember one of those incidents. There's a story in the Gospels where some Sadducees, which were the ones that didn't believe in the resurrection, they come to Jesus and they ask him a trick question. And they pose it in the form of a parable. And the parable goes like this. They say there's this guy, and there's this woman, and she's married to this guy, and the guy dies. So she marries his brother. And then the brother dies. And then she marries the next brother. And then that brother dies, and she marries the next brother. And by the time her life is over, she's been married to all 7 brothers. This is the story they tell Jesus. And they say to Jesus, so if there's a resurrection, whose wife is she going to be when that time comes? And, you know, all these arguments Jesus gets sucked into about this, they're about physical resurrection. But then after Jesus' resurrection and the Jesus movement begins to spread, this interesting thing happens where the whole idea of resurrection, in the imagination and thinking, the theology, if you will, of the early Jesus followers, it morphs into a spiritual image. Resurrection as a spiritual image representing the renewal of the human person, the transformation, the transforming journey of a human person. And, you know, I love a good mystery. I grew up reading mystery novels. I don't read a lot of fiction now, but when I do, it's because my wife says, here's the latest mystery novel you have to read. And so I love a good mystery, and that's one of the reasons I'm fascinated with this evolution of thought around the idea of resurrection in the early church, is because nobody knows how it happened. I mean, I'm a church history hound. I've read this guy's like 600-page book on these questions, and at the end he says, yeah, I don't really know who put this together, right? No one knows who first thought, wait a minute, resurrection, this isn't just about the body. This is about being resurrected as a person in your being in a way that changes your life. So the reality is that within a couple of decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, this language of death and resurrection becomes part of the sort of spiritual journey lexicon of the early church. One of my favorites is Ephesians 5:15, where Paul says, wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. When? Now. not later after you die. He's saying, participate in this now, rise from the dead now. And then the apostolic writings, the letters as we call them in the New Testament, the epistles, they get imbued with all this language about a new creation and new human being. Colossians 3 says that as we have embraced Christ, this is what it says, we have, quote, put on the new human being who is being renewed upwardly as he comes to recognize the image of the one creating him. You hear that? There's all this new. Now they got, the early Christians, they got some of that new creation imagery from the Old Testament prophets. You know, if you read the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, these guys, beginning of their books, they're angry. They're angry at the Israelites for their unfaithfulness to God and their sin and all the unjust ways they're living. And right, by the end of their book, their hearts have softened. They realize God is eventually going to bring the story about. And by the end of the prophetic books, they're all talking about, you know, the deserts are going to bloom with flowers and the rivers are going to flow and the rains are going to wash all the bad stuff away. And that's that new creation imagery. But the New Testament writers, Paul in particular, they're fascinated with this idea that out of the sort of death kind of living that we get steeped in the world, that God is going to work in us and a new human being is going to be created out of us, out of the remnant of who we are. It's this resurrection imagery. And the imagery of death and resurrection, then it also finds its way into the baptismal imagery of the early church. And again, nobody knows who put this together. There's no record of it anywhere. So at some point, well, let me read you what Paul says. This is where you hear this imagery maybe most beautifully in the New Testament. In Romans 6, Paul says, through baptism, we were buried with him, with Christ, taken down into death so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the splendor of the Father, in the same way, even so, we should be taking this journey of rising into newness of life. So at some point, somebody looked at a Christian baptism and they saw death and resurrection. Now, I don't know, maybe that was one of the early church fathers sitting in his study thinking theologically, but I like to picture some early Jesus follower who was out at the lake with his group, and they were baptizing people, and they watched somebody get lowered under the water and come up, and all of a sudden the light bulb went on, and they turned to their friend and they said, oh my gosh, do you see it? This is death and resurrection. Jesus died and he rose, and he's inviting us into a spiritual death and resurrection, a renewal of our person. So, from now until Easter and for a few weeks beyond, we're going to walk down the resurrection road with St. Luke in his gospel. Because you see, one way we can think about Jesus' ministry is that all through his ministry, Jesus is inviting the people around him into death and resurrection, to a kind of seeing and a kind of spiritual movement that of the heart that would allow love to flow in and love to flow out. So we're going to start this morning with a story that Jesus tells in Luke chapter 16. And Luke doesn't really give us any introduction, which is interesting. He doesn't say, and then Jesus said, he just kind of goes, here it is. But he does, however, set it in a particular context, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. But let's read the story. It goes like this. Jesus says, there was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and he fared sumptuously every day. I say that to Linda every night. On what shall we fare sumptuously this evening? He fared sumptuously every day, but there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs that fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torment in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and he saw Abraham afar off. And he saw Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And then he cried out and he said, the rich man cried out and he said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and come and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in these flames. But Abraham said, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus received difficult things, but now he is comforted and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great chasm fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us." And then the rich man said, "I beg you then, Father Abraham, that you would send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may warn them, lest they also come to this place of torment." And Abraham said to him, "They have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them." And the rich man said, "No, Father Abraham, but only if one goes to them from the dead will they repent." Which, when I hear that, I think, he knows his brothers. He knows that his brothers basically are just like he was before this moment. You know, Abraham says, they got the Moses and the priests. He goes, that's never going to work. So Abraham said to him, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead." So I think there's some really, Jesus is trying to tell us something. He's telling this story to help us see something very rich, profound, crucial, important. But I feel like that's really my sermon. That's what I want to talk about. But I feel like before I do that, I just want to take a moment and address how modern Christians have tended to read this story. Modern Christians have tended to read this story sort of like a voyeur's window into the technicalities of hell. Right? A lot of times when Christians want to talk about what happens to people when they die, they go, well, you know, the story about the rich man and Lazarus, and you know, that Jesus is telling this story so that we'll see that we don't want to be on fire forever, and then we'll do whatever we need to do, you know, to make that so that doesn't happen. In fact, many preachers have said this is not a parable. Jesus is telling a true story. He's telling a story about these 2 people who died, and one's in heaven and one's in hell, and now this is, you know, what's going on. The first issue with that, I'll tell you the bigger one in a second, but the first issue with that is that this isn't really heaven and hell. This is Abraham's bosom, which in Jewish thought is sort of like the place of God comforting the dead if in fact they end up conscious. A lot of Jews just thought you'd be unconscious after death. But if you did, you would be in Abraham's bosom. They didn't have the Jewish people did not have the heaven-hell sort of continuum of thinking that we have. And then the reason my Bible translates it Hades and not hell, your Bible might say hell, but it's Hades because it's actually the Greek abode of the dead is Hades. So this story is taking this concept of Abraham's bosom and this Greek concept of the abode of the dead and the place where the dead will suffer if they have not lived well, and it's sort of holding those opposite to each other. But the bigger thing is this: Jesus didn't make up this story. He's not telling a story that he supernaturally knows happened to people because he's the omniscient God. And so he says, hey, let me tell you about these 2 people because I get to look in eternity and I see because the truth is that in Jesus' day, there were actually 7 versions of this story already circulating in the rabbinic literature of the day about this rich man who dies and this beggar named Lazarus. So this is almost like a Jewish spiritual folktale that goes around. Jesus just adds the twist of the brothers at the end, the 5 brothers at the end. That is his addition. But I share all that to say, don't make out of this passage some technical theological understanding of the afterlife. You know, those are big questions. I am a person who believes in an afterlife. Many of us have wrestled a lot with all these questions about what that looks like and the idea of hell and how we understand that. And if there is a concept of that, what does it mean and what do you do with that and how should you think about it? And so my sermon's not about hell, sorry. If you're looking come this morning, Pastor Fran will tell you everything you ever needed to know about hell. It's not that. What I will say is this. I think that after we've heard Jesus talk about how the Father loves us, and after we've heard Jesus talk about the point being love, and the point being coming out of darkness and light. I think all that moves us away from this too easily mechanical idea that even Christian history has had about heaven and hell, where it's just like, depending on the version, you better accept Jesus or you're going to burn. You better be a good church person, or you better do all the rituals of the church, or whatever it is. But it's been held up to that, much more in Western Christianity than Eastern Christianity. Western Christianity got Dante's Inferno and has been, obsessed with all of that. But for me, all those questions, it's not, I'm saying too much about this. Here's what I want to say. No, this is a good thought. Here's what I want to say. Don't make it about the question of where you end up. That's not the question Jesus or the New Testament writers are most concerned with. It's a question. The question they're concerned with is what you become. And that's different. That's completely different. And that's why I love something that this character, Elder Zosima, who is one of the characters in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, the great Russian writer. There's a section where Elder Zosima is wrestling with these questions about the afterlife, and this is what he says. He says, I ask myself, what is hell? And I answer thus, hell is the suffering of no longer being able to love. And I think that catches the spirit of what Jesus came to resurrect us into. So, let's go back to the story. We should not fail to notice that the central thing we're told about the man in Hades is that he's rich. Jesus is telling this story to the Pharisees. And in a bit of contextual commentary, right after the story, Luke tells us this. Now the Pharisees loved money. So what that tells me is Jesus told this story to the Pharisees, knowing they loved money, and he tells this story about the rich man very much with that in mind. He's poking them with the telling of this story. What the story of the rich man is really about is a failure of vision. There's this sort of irony where the rich man finally sees Lazarus clearly, but he only sees him after he dies. In life, Lazarus was literally at his gate, but he was completely invisible. The tragedy of the rich man wasn't that he was rich, but that he lived his whole life without seeing what was right in front of him. There's this story I read years ago, true story, and I can't remember who the person I'll reference here in a second was, but the story was that as a sort of social experiment, this group took a homeless man and they sat him on the sidewalk to panhandle right on the edge of kind of a tough neighborhood and a good neighborhood so that people would walk by who had the means to help him. And so he spent the whole day panhandling, and people, threw some money in his jar or his cup. And then the next day they took a famous actor. They dressed him as a homeless person and they put him in the exact same spot. And people did the exact same thing. They went by and threw a few bucks in his plate and nobody recognized who it was, because once he was regarded as a homeless person, he was invisible. Nobody looked at him and said, I recognize this guy. They just kind of went, oh, homeless guy, here's, right? So Lazarus was invisible to this man whose gate he sat at day by day. So I'm intrigued also by the conversation between the rich man and Abraham. The rich man says, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water to cool my tongue. And there is a part of me, and I may be very well reading into the text, but there's a part of me that thinks that's interesting, that he doesn't say, Father Abraham, come on, have mercy. I have this problem. Can you do anything for me? His first thought is, send Lazarus to serve me, to do something for me. Because Lazarus was probably in the class of people who would have done those kinds of things. Maybe that's just me. But Abraham's response is, he says to the rich man, things are this way because you had all the good stuff in life. And Lazarus suffered. And then he says, besides that, between you and us, there's this great chasm fixed. And I think Jesus is sort of suggesting a double meaning when he talks about the chasm, because certainly in the story there is a chasm between Abraham's bosom and Hades. But there's also a chasm that was already there between the rich man and Lazarus. It's the chasm of who's wealthy and who's poor. It's the chasm of who is societally acceptable and valuable and who isn't. It's the chasm of who's important and who's not. And that chasm existed before either of them died, and that chasm had been growing quietly in the rich man's heart across his whole life. There's another little detail in the story that's very easy to miss. Jesus says that the rich man feasted sumptuously every day. Every day there was food on the table. Every day the table was full of good things. And every day Lazarus was outside the gate, hungry, sick, longing for scraps. But the tragedy of the story isn't just wealth and poverty. The tragedy is that these two worlds existed a few feet apart. And one man couldn't even or didn't even see the other world that was so near to him. And here's where Luke does something really interesting. Luke very quietly places this story right after another story that's even more famous. It comes right after the story of the prodigal son. And they both have feasts in them. And Luke does a very interesting thing. There's a word for feasting, like when you're just talking about the meal in Greek. But when Luke talks about the rich man feasting, and then he talks about the feast being thrown by the father of the prodigal son, that's not the word he uses. He uses the Greek word ephraino, which your Bible might translate as like making merry. Every day the rich man made merry at his sumptuous feasts, and when the prodigal son comes home, his father says, "My son was dead and he's alive. Let us welcome him. Let us make merry." And Luke uses this word so that his reader, which you would never get in English, we'd never catch it, but so that his first readers who read him in Greek, so that they would go, oh, he's asking us to contrast two kinds of feasts or two kinds of feasting. So, each story has a table, but they're very different. In the story of the prodigal son, when the lost son comes home, the father throws open the doors and the music starts and the tables are set and everyone is invited into the celebration. And Luke is telling us that one feast is the feast of the blind, and the other feast is the feast of the seeing. And Jesus is not so gently. I mean, when I preach, I always want to make Jesus gentle, because I think most people receive Jesus when he's gentle and he's warm. I mean, that's how Jesus was with most people, right? We read the stories of the Gospels. Jesus is the one who's having compassion on people, and he's saying, your sins are forgiven. But sometimes Jesus says things pretty directly to us. And I think that in this story, Jesus is not so gently asking us which of those tables we want to be our feast. Feast of the blind or the feast of the seeing. Because resurrection, this journey we're beginning to talk about as we move toward Easter, is not just something that happens when we die. Resurrection begins when we begin to open our eyes. It's no coincidence that in our Easter text, which this will be our Easter text on Easter morning, of the supper at Emmaus, if you know that story, the disciples Jesus walks with, and he goes to their home at Emmaus, that in that story, Luke describes the climactic moment for the two disciples when everything clicks and they recognize Jesus. He describes it with these words, "And the eyes of both of them were opened." In Luke's gospel, Luke is doing a thing that's about seeing, 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 seeing. Now here's the thing. It's way more comfortable for me to think about what I think other people need to see. And it's much more daunting for me to think about what I think I need to see. So I don't want to stand up here this morning and say, now you people, here's all the things that you need to see. That's when preachers preach down to people. It's a waste of time. So I was thinking that maybe what I would do is tell you some of the things that I've struggled to see across my adult life. So I'm just going to tell you what some of them are. Maybe weird content for a sermon, but you'll get over it. I numbered them so you'd know when I was shifting from one confession to the next here. So the first one is this. I just spent decades of my own adult life struggling to see my own value. And I think that's true for a lot of us, that God looks at us and he sees our glory and he speaks over us about the glory that he made us for and all the good things. But it's often we ourselves who have the hardest time seeing the good things that God built into us. That's been a long journey for your pastor. It isn't really a long journey now. That one's been put to bed fairly well. Here's the second thing. When I was younger, I was really blind to how my words often hurt people in conversations. Even back to high school, I remember times where I was like this, where I was trying to make myself big or important in a conversation, and I was acting a certain way, and I said things, and I didn't realize that those things were being hurtful to the people around me. And it took me a long time to be willing to see that. In the early days of my faith, this is the third thing. There's 8 if you're counting. In the early days of my faith, I didn't see that becoming the Bible guy, which I saw as faithfulness. You know, I'm the son of a Shakespeare scholar, for real, in real life. And so I was raised to be a reader. So when I got a hold of the book, I thought, finally something I can be important at. I'm going to be the guy who knows the book. And I thought that was just faithfulness, but I didn't realize how that was feeding into my own sense of self-importance. That people in my life started to regard me as, well, you know, Fran, he knows the Bible, and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But I didn't see it. I didn't see that was a thing happening in me. And then the fourth thing is, you know, I've so often defaulted to seeing life and situations just from how they affect me, which has kept me in life a lot from being empathetic about how situations that I was a part of were also affecting other people. And I mean, in one sense, we have to give ourselves a certain amount of grace. And I've thought about this a lot in my life. It's very hard to evaluate life from anywhere other than your own position. You are you. You live in your body, in your circumstances, with your background and your experiences. It's impossible to look at the world not through some degree of your own lenses. So it's natural that we wonder. It's natural and it's okay that we wonder, like, how are things affecting me, right? But we can also have a blindness to how things are affecting other people. And I had a lot of that in my life. And it kept me from looking at other people, I mean, even as a young pastor, from really looking at other people and saying, oh my goodness, what is the depth of this struggle like for them? And I've had to do, I guess, what I would call a lot of inner work, you know, over that kind of seeing. Number 5. In my marriage across these decades, Lynn and I, we've been at this for a while. So, am I allowed to say how long we've been married? I know I'm not allowed to say how old I am. We're going to be married 44 years in May. The end of May. And in my marriage to this beautiful, best partner I could ever dream of, I have had a long journey of where I've needed to be deepened in terms of really seeing her and in terms of really feeling her struggles and being willing to see when she struggles, when she's going through something. And a long deepening journey. There was a long deepening journey where the Spirit of God was saying to me, like, you gotta see her. You gotta stop thinking about how all this affects you. You gotta see her. Gotta see her. You gotta see her. And then this really weird thing happened. Probably, 20 years into our marriage, where one day I felt something. I experienced something in my being. With regard to Linda, I hadn't experienced, was that I experienced in my being a spontaneous longing for her joy. And I'm not saying, like, look at me, I just long for her, I'm such a great husband. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I hadn't experienced that before. I had known I should want her joy, right? Good Christian husband. I've read Ephesians, wash your wife with the water of the word so she becomes the beautiful bride, blah, blah. I get all Paul's imagery. But one day, I just thought to myself, how I long, she was struggling with something, I don't remember what it was, and I just thought, how I long for her joy. And I thought, oh my goodness. But all that was this journey of seeing, of things being peeled back. Even with our work in Haiti, when we first started working in Haiti 20 plus years ago, I didn't see how my own desire to feel valuable or important played so heavily into that. It's not that I didn't care about the people in Haiti, it's that we went there and I saw the need and I thought, oh my gosh, all the good work we're going to do. And, all the things, sometimes people call that, trying to be the great white hope in the world, and I was like, we're going to do all this stuff, And it took sitting in, leaky huts with dirt floors with people and holding malnourished children on my lap and having parents beg us to build a school because, only 2% of the adults could read and they wanted their kids to be able to read and write and have a different kind of future. And watching people die because they had no medical care or because the water they got from the river wasn't clean. And those things made me realize this isn't about me at all. And the funny thing was, once I started to have that eye-opening experience, it's really interesting, both the pain and the beauty of our work in Haiti increased. Like it was more painful because it wasn't about me, it was about their real struggles, but the beauty of entering into it with them felt more significant. I couldn't even see for a long time how my sense of value was too tied to being a pastor, When we came to start this church those decades ago, all the pastors in my life told me the same thing, which was not to do it. They said, don't do it. It's a bad idea. First, because it probably won't work. And second of all, it's a bad idea because it's just going to be a painful experience, You're going to start this church, you're going to become friends with these people, and then they're going to hurt you. So for goodness sake, just don't do this thing, Just go take a church somewhere. I was wanting to become a pastor. Just take a church somewhere. And of course, when they said that to me, don't do it, impetuous young Fran Lehman said, oh, well, I'll show you how competent I can be. I sure as heck fire will do it. And, I puffed out my chest and I whatever. But all of that was tied in ways to my soul that really just weren't the best. And today, the funny thing is, God has a great sense of humor. And please don't hear arrogance in this. I think I have more valuable things to say today as a pastor than in all my previous journey. And yet the deepest of longing of my heart is not to stand up here and blab to you guys about the Christian faith. It's just to go live it in my life. I just want to be a human being in the world, following Jesus and living out the love and continuing to grow. But God apparently wants me to still do this. But anyway, and then the last thing I'll just say is this. I've struggled across my adult life, as I think most of us have, with whether or not I really see the people who are marginalized, who are oppressed, who have less in the world, who have less access to food and water and power and any mobility in their life or any say over what happens to them. I have struggled with that. I did a thing this week, which I did a long time ago, and I thought I would do it again, which is I went online and I plugged in my Linda's and my income, and I asked where that puts us in the global distribution of wealth. Don't do it. So Linda and I are in the top 1.5% of the global distribution of wealth. Now, I know when you hear that, what you're thinking is, how much are we paying you? You've been to a lot of you have been to my 1,200 square foot fixer-upper. So it's not that. It's that if you're middle class in America, that's kind of where you are. And I think most of us have done kind of one of a couple of things. One is many of us try to look away, right? Like, hey, we'll say to ourselves, it's unfortunate that it's that way, but that's their life. That's not my life. That's all I'm going to think about it. The other thing we sometimes do is we do take it seriously, and I mean this in a good way, and we look and we say, hey, we should help people. We should do something. So we help people. We give some money. We do those things, but sometimes, and that's all good, but sometimes then in our soul, we put a little bow on it and we say, so I've done what I need to do. That was my kind of moral obligation, whatever. And then it doesn't really go deeper than that maybe in our soul, which makes me think of the thing Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, his great soliloquy on love. Paul says, if I give all my possessions to the poor, all of them, but I don't have love, right? He says, then it doesn't matter, right? So that's the thing that we're actually trying to get to. The thing we're actually trying to get to is this thing about love. And, I don't know if you may or may not know that my early Sunday morning habit is I kind of rework. I go back through my sermon and I'm like, how am I saying these things and what do I want to say? And I'm doing that at like 4:30 this morning, and I get to this part of my sermon and I'm sitting there and I'm wrestling once again, as I need to for the rest of my life, with this question of, is it love inside me? Because it's not about money. Is it love inside me? And as I wrestled with it, I had to go online and give away some money. Because that, in that moment, was what love looks like. So, seeing is a funny thing. It's not just a matter of cognition or information. Like you could say to me, what do I need to see, Pastor Fran? Just tell me. It doesn't work that way. It's more like a matter of epiphanies, of getting our lenses swapped out by some mysterious combination of our own desire to escape blindness, the work of the sacred Spirit, and allowing the experience of other human beings to kind of invade our experience. And somehow through all that, then we begin to see. When Jesus talks about our blindness, in Matthew chapter 13, and that is the context, our blindness, he makes the most enigmatic statement. This is what he says: for everyone who has, to him more will be given. This used to be so mysterious to me. And he will have an abundance, but whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. And I used to think, boy, that just makes God sound mean. But Jesus is talking about blindness. Jesus is saying that our openness to the epiphanies determines their continuance. And if we shut down the epiphanies, or we think we've seen enough and all we need to see, we're going backwards. That list of the places that I rambled on about that I have struggled to see in my life, those are the things that I can tell you I see better today. But I've been on this journey a long time, and so I know that there's more to see. There just is. I know that I'm not done seeing new things and having God open up my eyes, and I have to be willing to experience that. It's like the line at the end of Men in Black. The good one, the first one. When Tommy Lee Jones says to Will Smith, 1,500 years ago, everybody knew the earth was the center of the universe. 500 years ago, everybody knew the earth was flat. 15 minutes ago, you knew human beings were alone on planet Earth. Imagine what you'll know tomorrow. And that's how I feel. Imagine what I will see tomorrow. I hear Jesus' words from John's gospel ringing in the back of my soul. Do you want to get well? Do you want to see? I think we walk by gates every day. Gates where someone is lonely, gates where someone is hurting, gates where someone is waiting to be seen. And here's the thing. It's not about money. Don't walk out of here and say, so Pastor Fran said we should give away more money. It's not about money, it's about seeing, because the person just outside your gate might be your partner. They might be your child, or your parent, or your brother, or sister. For me, I got a couple of cousins just outside my gate. It might be your neighbor, or the person you run into at the coffee shop, or it might be the person who is in your field of vision in some way, who is desperately trying to survive. There is a word of correction in all this from the Spirit of God to us, Sometimes the Lord says to us, like, hey, you really need to think about this. And the word is, wake up, O sleeper, rise from the dead, open your eyes, Christ will shine on you. But it's not a word meant to bring us into more bondage to shame and religion. Because, I don't know if you've learned this by now, that kind of word just never gets us anywhere. It's an invitation to come out of the blindness that the world and our fears have subconsciously tempted us to cultivate. It's easier to stay blind. That's what I'm trying to say. I was told as a young man that I just needed to accept Jesus, believe in Jesus, and behave like a good Christian, that this is what the journey is. But Jesus is actually saying something very different in this story. He's saying that to recover my humanity, by its very nature, is to open my eyes and walk out of the cave into the brightness and beauty of the daylight of love. Luke is saying this is the resurrection road, and the price of admission onto the road is the desire to see and to keep seeing. That's it. The person who says, nope, I've seen enough. I know what God needs to tell me. I know what I need to know in life. There's nothing else I need to see, nothing else I need to rethink, nothing I need to check in my heart, no one else that I need to see. Luke says, sorry, there's no resurrection road for you. But if we'll step onto the road, where the road leads is to the feast, to the smiles and the laughter and the music and the dancing, where over all of us, over all the people we love, over our enemies, over all the Lazaruses of the world, over every tribe and tongue and people and nation, God speaks the big, beautiful word, which is, behold, I'm making all things new. Or as the great wise Samwise Gamgee once said, Gandalf, is everything sad going to come untrue? And the answer is yes. Lord, thank you for this wild journey of seeing more. I have seen so much. You have been so gracious to walk with me and gently, gently prod me to open my eyes a little more and a little more and a little more to so many things and to so many people. And I know that there is more of that journey to come. And my prayer for us is that we would desire to see, and we would step onto that road, and we would walk that road all the way into what for us has been unfathomable love. Amen.